This is our next to the last class. We'll do the way of the teacher for a couple of different weeks, and I hope you heard that after that I'll be teaching a class on white. Oh, it's slipping right out of my head.
Fragility.
Fragility. Okay. A very impressive book as I've begun reading it, and it's worth all of us who are in relative positions of power, relative positions of privilege, to read that and at least try to integrate that into our thinking as we move forward. All right. So anyway, the way of the teacher, which is its basic principle, is be open to outcome, not attached to outcome. As a first grade teacher, Judy knows that one of the most interesting things about it is you can do really good work and you can see these kids move along and you say, okay, they are really doing well. But then you have to hand them off to the second grade teacher and the third grade teacher, and they're a long way from getting to the end of that education. And you know that you have to, whatever it is that you think you've done well, you have to turn it over to something larger, something more than just whatever you think is the correct answer. And sometimes we forget that in the midst of our daily lives. How many have tried to control something in your life at some point or another?
Still trying?
Still trying.
Every day.
In every way.
Yeah. And at least part of the idea of what the teacher is about opening us up to possibilities, opening us up to more rather than sitting in a space of finish. And we like the space of finished because it allows us to stop thinking, but it also makes it so we stop living, because life will always draw us further. And in the midst of it, like we were talking about earlier, it will tell us that we're not in control. Right? So all of us in attempting to be teachers, and I hope you've seen that while one of these may be your more natural way, part of you has to be each one of these. Right? You've got to live out the healer as well as the teacher. You've got to live out the warrior. You've got to live them all out in some way or another. Because if you're not consciously trying to live out the better definition of them, you will get dragged to the worst definition of them. And what we want is to try to be as effective as possible. Welcome, guys. So to be a good teacher, one of the key points is you have wisdom. What is wisdom for you? What does that word mean? Because she didn't really explain it. She did give some different characteristics of it, but she didn't explain what it is itself.
For me, it means knowing yourself.
Good, nice. And living out of an authentic space in that knowing. Yes.
Knowing,
Go ahead.
knowing what to say and when to say it.
Whoa, that's a big one, isn't it? Because I know what to say sometimes, but I shouldn't.
When I was in my early 55, something like that, I asked my father what wisdom was. My father was an uneducated man. And I asked him the question, and he says, well, it's the things you know that you don't know you know.
Oh,
That's how my father raised us too.
nice.
He said,
Nice.
"Wisdom comes when you realize you don't know what you don't know."
Yeah. She did give 4 different characteristics of that wisdom, and she called them the qualities of wisdom. So let me just go to this. Oh, there's your whole wheel. We'll talk about more of that later, but here's the 4 qualities of wisdom that she talked about: clarity, objectivity, discernment, and detachment. Detachment we'll talk about quite a bit later on, but oops, sorry about that. If you have wisdom, what is the clarity that is there? What does clarity mean in wisdom?
See
I
how we
think-
all understand it?
I think it means a little bit of getting away from the emotions of the
Yeah.
moment.
Yeah.
And getting yourself, like what I do is I breathe deep, I do deep breaths and calm myself. So that, because if I don't do that, then I can't really see what's right in front of me.
Yeah.
It's a certain amount of certainty in sort of trusting what it is that you're experiencing and how to respond to it.
Yeah. I think sometimes it's having certainty in the right things to have certainty in too. Right? Like I see a lot of people that are busy holding up something that's more opinion than fact, but they're holding it up as fact. That's not clarity. That is a cloudy type of thinking because it has no basis to give solid ground on. Not that it's a wrong opinion, but it's also not that which will give the best clarity. What else?
Stoicism.
Stoicism, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. The second quality is objectivity. And maybe that goes to the point I was just making, is that we all like our perspective. That's why we're in the space where we have that perspective. But if I hold that only as all truth making, as definitive, I'm going to be less wise. So where's one of the spaces where you have been not as objective as what would have helped in the moment?
Oh, calling the president an idiot.
Yeah. Yeah. What else?
I think that was objective, Mike.
I also think that there are times when you have a personal stake in something going a certain way or whatever, you know, that you want something so badly that you kind of lose the objectivity of what's the real situation.
The good news is we rarely do that with our children.
Ha, I was just gonna say that. That was always the
My
hardest
daughter,
part.
first thing.
But the challenge about parenting is trying to be the wise one who doesn't have to say, I have all the right answers, but also can speak truth into that thing that opens up doors to that younger generation, right? And sometimes that's not so much being smart as it is just saying, I can see larger. I choose to see larger.
When I
other-
had
No,
3
go ahead.
teenage girls, the oldest was 2 years older than the twins. And oh my God, the hormones in the house were just awful for 4 years. And I couldn't get there until I had enough confidence that I had taught them what I needed to teach them. And it's that letting go and letting them be their own.
Yeah.
That was the most difficult time to not be objective, or to be objective.
But part of what you're talking about is that second point that we'll get to in just a second. You had some trust, some confidence there so that you could be the wiser space, in the wiser space. So we'll come back to that in a bit. But let's first of all talk about discernment. How have you learned to have discernment?
The hard way.
The hard way often.
By not having it and barging in or sticking my foot in or
Yeah.
opening my mouth at the wrong time and then realizing that was a horrible mistake.
Yeah. Here's the problem, Judy, is, okay, so a number of years ago, I was wanting to know more about discernment, because discernment shows up on most lists of spiritual attributes, right? Some of those things you wanted, but nobody writes about it. All right, the number of books that are out there about spiritual discernment are slim to none. And And I think it's because it's so hard to figure out just what to do with it. Because there's not a, if you just A, B, C, then you have discernment. It is an ongoing and struggling process that makes it so that we often fail. And for not bad reasons. I was talking to a lady just today on the phone, and I repeated a story that I heard a number of years ago while I was doing that search. There was a book that had at least a little bit of stuff on discernment, and talked about this woman who was in a class in the New York City area somewhere, and it was about trying to figure out the spiritual life and about discernment, and they got an assignment during lunch to go out in the city and walk and be very open to how God might be speaking, and not to just react, but to really listen in each moment. So she's walking down the sidewalk, and coming towards her is a woman with a bag full of groceries. And the bag tears, and oranges and milk are all over, right? And her first instinct, a very good instinct, was, let me run in and help her. But then she remembered her assignment, and she paused for a second. She looks, and over on the stoop over to the side are 3 boys sitting on the stairs. And they look at her as if, lady, aren't you going to come help this person? Because you look like the type of person who would help. And she pauses, and they get up and they help. Going and doing that wouldn't have been a wrong thing, but was it the spiritually right thing to do in the moment? And so it's not that we override discernment with bad things. It's that maybe we miss the best opportunity, or the opportunity for that moment, because somehow that drew out of these kids something that they wouldn't have done if she would have.
I've always gone up and talked to people. Like when I would go to the mall and just talk to people, I was just somebody would look very interesting, and we would just start a conversation. And some friends of mine go, you need to be careful. And I said, I listened to my inner something, and I used discernment. I felt very comfortable with the people I approached, and I came away with some of the most interesting encounters, and still do. And it's like, I don't know, I just feel like sometimes there's a voice in me that just says, you need to approach this person.
But I think that's much of what discernment is being open to something, being able to sort through all the different choices, and being able to decide in that moment what is the best choice. And if I already have set in my mind the right choice, I might not be making the right choice.
And it might allow holding back, as the woman did in your story, to allow someone else the space in which to do what they need to do.
Yeah.
And I think we can see that with our children and in the workplace and all over the place, really.
Absolutely. The hard part is that we teach really well to each other the singular right answers. And we like our certainty of this is always right. But when we do that, we often leave other people outside of the circle of having something to add.
And by doing that, we miss the gifts that they have for us.
I'm sorry, you kind of broke
By
up.
leaving people outside, we miss the gifts that they're carrying for us.
Yeah. The problem is that no matter how good our truth is in this tunnel space that we make, there's always more, larger, different truth out here. And maybe it's not the one that I need to grasp hold of, but if I don't open myself up to view why it is that somebody else might be, then I'm going to miss the understanding that allows me to connect to them. And I might miss that maybe that's a good choice for me, right? That will enlarge my vision. But if we already have right answers, it closes us off. Thus, that's why trust is the second really big thing for effective teachers. As a first grade teacher, you have to ultimately trust 6 and 7-year-olds. 6 and 7-year-olds are not very well developed yet, shall we say, right? But I've learned that that's the same thing that I could say about adults in a church. It's not that you're poorly developed, but there's a lot of development still happening. And we have to learn to trust each other in those moments.
Where I learned that, to really even getting that thought of how to trust people or others was, I was a Catholic music director down at the Newman Center for about 16, 17 years. And the way they handled it, they didn't have like a celebration team. You had a whole bunch of different groups that had a leader and they did music, and we were told, here's the 3 readings, the Old Testament, New Testament, Gospel, and our prayers, because in the Catholic Church they're assigned.
Yes.
And I nobody taught me, but eventually I would sit and I'd read each one of those and then sit and try and figure out where they connected.
Yeah.
I used to get people all the time like, how did your music? I went to another service and their music didn't make sense, but your music hits the sermon. Not just trusting myself, I had to learn to trust God.
You broke up,
I
Leticia.
said it wasn't just learning how to trust myself. I had to learn how to trust God in that place of discernment.
Yeah. So I want to show you my favorite line about trust. And it's my favorite just because it's probably the one that challenges me the most. It's this one that says, trust is being comfortable with the uncomfortable. Being comfortable with uncertainty, you might say. Right? That which I don't want to have. Because we like to have certainty, don't we? But as soon as you step towards each other, some of you might more than others, there's more and more uncertainty. Right? And that's not necessarily a bad thing, because that uncertainty challenges me, but might also draw me towards something, even as it makes me uncomfortable. And so you have 2 choices in that moment. You go back and you sit in what you already know, and you don't allow this to change you, or you keep moving and you trust.
Y'all remember the statement, you probably have heard, trust but verify?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does that fit?
Well, trust doesn't mean that you walk blindly off a cliff, or at least in all moments it doesn't mean that. There's ways that we build and learn trust from each other, right? But it means that we err on the side of moving towards rather than running from.
The author uses the phrase, be comfortable with states of not knowing.
Comfortable with states of not knowing.
Mhm.
Yeah. And when we move towards each other, there's a lot we don't know about each other. But how many know that we sure put a big mask on top of that other person very often, whether or not it's true. And we react as if that mask we placed is true. But in response to that, she said, the opposite of trusting is the opposite of trusting in the unexpected is trying to control the uncontrollable. And so if I don't look at you and try to trust you, in reality, what I'm trying to do too often is trying to control you as if you are controllable from my position. Because, you know, you guys aren't even controllable from your own position, let alone from mine. Right? But we try to do that on a regular basis. Many of the skills we've learned in school, not just the pedagogy skills of teaching, but also the logic skills, the scientific skills that we've learned, we use those to try to prove why our way is right or wrong, instead of trying to be the teacher that helps others to learn.
Well, one of the other pieces that comes to my mind, at least, is that there's a lot of ambiguity in life.
Yeah.
And do you let the ambiguity sort of slow you down or freeze you, or do you keep sort of moving forward and sort of trust that in the ambiguity you'll find your way to the right way?
Yeah. Yeah. And that there's not a singular right way in the same way as we want to have it be that way, right? And most of that from my point of view, well, most of it is point of view from my point of view. If you're sitting 90 degrees to my right, to say that the right path is to come and walk on the path I am on, it's probably not right. It's to take some kind of parallel that maybe comes to my path. But if we're trying to get to this objective in front of us, for that person to come over to me and then move may not be the answer. But that's the answer that we give very often. But it means that I have to do the third thing. I have to detach. That person 90 degrees to my right is on a different path. And while some of what I'm learning here is applicable over there, I have to say, maybe he's not meeting the cactus that I'm meeting. And so it doesn't need to have a warning against this kind of danger, right? So I have to let go of trying to define perfectly where he's at. So why don't you do it this way? With your significant other, why don't you always detach from that other person? Why is it that you have opinions about what they ought to do and how they ought to do it? Why do you do that with your kids?
So what about the word should?
Yeah.
When we use the word should, I'm all attached
Uh-huh.
to an objective that I'm expecting.
Yeah.
So if I detach from that, she uses the word care deeply from an objective place.
Yes.
I don't understand that. What do they mean by an objective place?
Let me give you an example, Mike. Maybe it'll help you. Laura Aldad, who worked here in the office next to me, came back a couple years ago because Art's wife, Sue, passed away. Do you remember that?
Yep.
And so I did Sue's service. And Laura admitted later to me, at one point I wanted to slap you, Jim, because in the midst of all the preparing for it, you were so calm and peaceful and detached that I thought, oh, she's not really listening to us. But she realized as she went further along, because what I was doing as I went into that space with a frame of mind of what I learned in seminary, which was the non-anxious presence. That in the midst of all the emotionality, the loss, the struggle, I needed to be the one who in that moment provided a calm space for them. And what she was going was, oh, he's not moved by all of this, and he doesn't understand all of this. And she's right in some ways, it feels like that, but it also was that I could care deeply because Laura was really important to me. Sue and Art are important to me. And I could do that without being in that space where I could help without being non-effective because my own emotions carried me over that. Does that make sense? So
Thank
that's
you.
what I think she means.
In my work on leadership, one of the expressions that I want to do, a true leader can keep their head when everybody else is losing theirs.
Uh-huh, uh-huh. And it doesn't mean you don't have emotion. It means that you put it into a certain space as you deal with the situation.
That's kind of why I brought up Stoicism before, Jim.
Yes,
I was with somebody that for years
Yeah.
that could not handle it.
Yeah.
He looked at Stoicism as completely negative, yet he wanted to test it when it was convenient for him.
sure. But more likely, he wanted to act as if Stoicism was ineffective because he had seen some of the ways that it is ineffective. Because when we take any of these things to the extreme, if in my detachment, I completely disconnect myself from that person in that funeral situation, I am going to be less effective in the role that I'm called to do. And so it's not like you can be completely non-anxious and detached. You have to sometimes, but you do that in order to be more effective in the role, right?
Yeah.
Stoicism works, but carried to an extreme, it will not. Most everything we do, we need to find, as Aristotle said, the golden mean of the right amount of usage of it, not too much or too little. We have to find the right amount of that, of those emotions. But the hard part in American society, one of the biggest things that we do is we believe in binary systems. Black, white, dark, night, day, all of those kinds of things. And so we think, if we're not careful, that if a little bit of it is good, a lot of it must be better. And so we go way over here to an extreme, and usually extremes are poor examples of that quality. But if we place them in opposition to each other, then we choose one to be better. And what we have to do is find the best of both. We have to find the right amount, the appropriate amount of both light and dark, not the two of them in opposition to each other. We have to live both of them. Yes.
In the case of that relationship, his idea, not just with me, but his idea of Stoicism was it was an affect that was negative. No question, it's negative.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I came to realize he was trying to control the uncontrollable.
Yeah. Right.
And we just, gosh.
Which is really good. But that's why I'm going to slip back up to the trust thing to talk about one thing that she talked about, because it's an important thing, and that is the idea of a trickster. Okay? In all cultures, we have been pretty consistent in designing somebody who was the trickster in our stories. Somebody who pushed on some of the ideas we already had and said, yeah, not quite sure. Look at Mike, there's a trickster. Somebody who said, who challenged the stories that were out there. Okay? Do you know where the trickster shows up, for example, in Christian and Jewish mythology? A lot of different places. One of the most blatant is in the story of Job. Remember the story of Job? Job's there being wonderful and righteous, and Shaitan goes to God in heaven and says, hey, the only reason he's good is because you've given him everything. And if I take away all that stuff, I'll bet he's not faithful to you anymore. Shaitan, the trickster, was foiled in that because Job was able to be faithful anyway, right? In New Testament, that Shaitan figure becomes Satan, who we turn into the evil one, but that's not where it started. Shaitan, Satan, is supposed to be that which challenges us to see more than what we would see just alone. Not to be in opposition to God. No matter how much in the centuries past Jesus, we've turned him into almost as powerful. In fact, I believe that there's a lot of my conservative friends that believe more in Satan than they do in God. And they've raised the power of that Satan figure to such an extreme because they haven't taken him for what he's supposed to be, which is the trickster, the one who tells different stories. So I want you to think back in your life about who was it that somehow told you a story or entered your life in such a way that it challenged you and made you have to reassess yourself and essentially gave you permission to walk a different way than what you thought you were going to. Who were some of those people?
I made a short list.
Okay, good. Tell us, Mike.
For myself, there's a story that I tell in my coaching work that says, you know, when the emperor of Japan called the admiral in to talk to him, and he told the admiral, "I want you to bomb Pearl Harbor." And the admiral said, "Yes, sir," and started to leave the room, and then turned around and said, "Then what?" And to me, that is a trickster.
That is a trickster. And the hard part is we can see the trickster just as the enemy, or we can see it as that which helps us to go forward differently. Who else was a trickster in your life?
I had a boyfriend when I was in college. It was my second boyfriend, and I'd had 1 year of college, and he said, "Are you going to school because you want to, or because your parents want you to?" And of course, both my parents have college degrees, and so I started to really wonder. And I thought, well, I don't know, and so I took a semester off from school. At the very beginning of that semester, because then I'm working waiting tables to support myself, I said, "Oh my God, I made a mistake. Now I know what I really want." And I wasn't sure before, but now I'm going to go back to school as soon as I can get into the next semester. I'm going right back to school, and I am not going to stop. I am going to get my degree. And I got really determined because of that.
Yeah, nice. But it took readjusting yourself, didn't it? Like,
Yeah, it
reassess.
really did. I really grew from that.
Yeah,
And if I hadn't had that semester off to really think about, you know, where I was at and what I wanted, I wouldn't have known. And I wouldn't have been as driven, I'm sure.
yeah, yeah.
Pardon me, but Mary brought her trickster in.
I noticed that. Look at that guy. You'll notice that tricksters are often given all kinds of frills and things that make it so that they are enticing to us, because sometimes we see the trickster as the like the term I use, the evil one that draws us down those paths we shouldn't go to, right? But that's not always the case. You tell stories about tricksters all the time. If you've ever listened to a story of Brer Rabbit was a trickster, right? And made people have to look beyond more than what they knew, right? Not always for their own good, but often for their education and growing.
This is probably a stretch, but I think about Darrell Shepherd. He was the 9-year-old boy that was part of a family that our church in Wilmette adopted. And I basically tutored and mentored him for about 9 years. And when I look back on what it was about that family that brought our church to adopt them, it was because they were yet another family who had lost a child to a drive-by shooting in Chicago. And I didn't really make the connection at the time, but now, you know, preventing gun violence and deaths is a key focus of my life. And I would not have gone down that path necessarily had I not ultimately come to realize that that was what it was about, you know, Darrell's family that drew me in. And, you know, it gave me opportunities to be a part of a life that seems to be going well now.
Yeah.
And it's brought a lot of, you know, positive connections and things into my life as a result. So I don't know if that would constitute a trickster, because he really had no idea of a role, you know, that he was playing in that way. But
Sure. Because tricksters aren't necessarily bad. They sometimes bring us to outcomes that have seemingly negative effects on us and can lead us into places where we realize, no, that's not the right choice for me, like in Siri's story. But they also, that wrong choice also allows our eyes to open, our world to open in ways that it wouldn't have without it.
One of the stories I like is Joe Garagiola's story.
Mhm.
When you're following a path and it comes to where the path splits, take it. To me, that's the trickster.
Yeah.
It's confronting you, and it's not always recognized at the moment it happens.
Right. Because one of the things that the trickster does is, as she points out in the book, presents surprises, right? I look at some of my conservative friends and the stuff they post. I think they post that so that everyone says, yay, I agree with you. And I'm not certain that that's good for me. And so I try to make sure that as I post things, I'm not just doing it so that you guys all like what I post, right? I like it when you like what I post. But the reality is when something surprises me, makes me look at things in an unexpected way, that's really a good thing for me. I just don't always have to like it that it's a good thing. But that means I have to invite the trickster in.
The event in Minneapolis was the giant trickster of our overall systemic racist culture.
Absolutely. And the question is what will we do? Will we fall back into the same patterns? Or will we allow this trickster to carry us forward to something that we wouldn't have dreamt of without his tricks?
Yep. Then what?
Then what? That's right. But what it means is we have to deal, kind of like what Meg said, with some sort of loss. Because the trickster essentially says, I'll give you this if you give me that. Right? It's often some type of a deal that gets presented before us. What is it that you're going to lose in order to go forward into this new thing? And there's lots of ways you can lose. One of the pieces that she put in there was, I don't remember who it was, but she talked about loss, and she said these are the different types of losses we have. Loss of attachments, loss of turf, loss of structure, loss of a future, loss of meaning. And you notice I put the word a in front of meaning because I think sometimes when we say we lose meaning, it's that we've lost the meaning that we had and have to figure out a new meaning. So usually when we lose any of these things, it's not that we don't have others, it's just we've lost one of them that meant a lot to us. And then the last one is loss of control. As you look at these different things, which one is one of your nemesises? Which one do you hate losing the most?
control.
I'm glad you all had a real quick
Control
answer.
faster.
And for me, it's loss of structure.
Uh-huh. Why?
Because I really like myself better when I have a structure to my life. This virus time has been a lot of sitting and a lot of not wasted time, but not doing the stuff that I most enjoy doing. And
Yeah. It's taking
And-
stuff away from you.
right. And so, and I look back on my life, and when I was teaching full time and a parent of small children, I got a heck of a lot done.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, you know, it seems kind of backwards that now I have all this time and I'm not getting anything done.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to lose track of what day it is,
That's right.
let alone what time of day it is.
That's right. But that's what a job gives to us, is it gives us meaning, purpose, structure that defines how we do things.
Well, and my stuff at church did that too.
Yeah.
It gave structure to my days. I knew when I was going to be going to meetings or doing the altar or whatever else I was doing, and then there wasn't reason to do those things, or not in the same way.
Or not in the same way. That's right.
But
And
she also added loss of loved ones.
yes, but I think that's included in other things, but you're right. She put that on there and I chose not to put it there. But I think that's loss of attachments or something else. But you're right. The people that we lose mean a lot, don't they?
Yep.
I'm with Judy.
Who has another one that is your hardest?
I'm with Judy. I hate it when I want something to go a certain way, and then my wife says, "Oh well, I don't know. Whatever you think is right."
That tricks.
Or
Yeah.
tell God your plans and watch God laugh.
Yeah. Or tell that to your wife and watch her.
For me, it's loss of control.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of us in America that struggle a lot with control issues because we've done so much as far as education and skill training, and we have so much stuff that allows us to have a lot of control. And I think, Judy, one of the reasons why these last few months have been so hard is it's tossed right on top of us how little control we have.
Yep.
You know, Judy and I were talking before most of you came here about the fire that's roaring up here on the mountains that we have no control over, right? And I hate that.
And it's really close to me.
Yeah.
I went out last night and took photos of it
Yeah.
and cried
Right. Right.
because it was just so overwhelming to see it.
Yeah. Anybody else want to tell about which loss is hard for you?
Well, I feel like for me, when I retired, there were lots of these that were wrapped up in, there were lots of losses.
Yeah.
So, you know, because there were some attachments that certainly was the structure. I was used to being the boss. And so the thing about control, the work that I did was very meaningful, and that I stepped away from. So, for me, the retirement journey was much more challenging in that very first year.
Yeah. I face that, Paula, every time I've switched from one church to another. I had to stop fixing the people over there, and suddenly it's somebody else's turf. Right? And I got to let go of, my job is to do that. Not wait. I wasn't finished yet.
Yeah. And then when I decided I would work again and be semi-retired, then it was reestablishing some of these things, but also realizing how different it was, and that it wasn't going to be the same.
Yeah. Yeah. So did you see what she gives as the antidote to loss? Ritual. That we place things in our life that remind us in the midst of what it is that's not the same as it was yesterday, about some larger meaning in the midst of that. Okay? So she talked about it to say that ritual is to fit together, to take these broken pieces of life and somehow bring them into some kind of a meaningful space. So it's the conscious act of recognizing life change and doing something to honor and support the change through the presence of such elements as witnesses, gift giving, ceremony, and sacred intention. And I added the word celebration, because just when if we just celebrate, even as someone is moving from a position of chairmanship of a committee and moving into something over here, if we celebrate the work that was done, it helps the transition to move into what will be. All of these give us ways to be able to do that. So how have you been how have you been ritualized through your life in meaningful ways? What's helped you?
I haven't actually been a quilter, but I'm realizing when I'm reading historical novels that often the losses are sewn into those patchworks.
Yes, they are.
Clothes that have, been discarded or whatever, but the pieces get put together in a either in a pattern or just randomly, but they're there as reminders for what has been.
Yeah, sometimes very purposely. I have a sister who right now is working on a quilt of a bunch of shirts of her son, and so is putting those into a space where he doesn't have to have them in his drawer, but he has them in his possession.
Right.
Right, in a new way. What other rituals have helped you?
For me, making art has been one,
Mm,
as well as shamanic journey work.
nice.
And there's a painting that I have, and I was working on it when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, and then, or maybe it was when she was diagnosed with dementia. I've forgotten which one it was, but in any case, there's it's a painting of a quail, and I used a number of lines in it, and there's one area of the quail where the lines just kind of went in these weird ways, because I just kind of lost my ability to focus and have as clear an intention about what I was doing. I was just kind of doing it, and so I've gone back and I've looked at that, and it's like, oh yeah, that's that moment that happened.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then there's another painting when she did die, and it was like I just finished the painting and she passed away, like right after that.
Nice.
And that painting happens to be a bird flying up into the sky.
Yeah, yeah. And what's happened sometimes with those rituals like that is they may not even start from a space where it'll be this person that it brings back to memory, but it becomes that. Right?
Yeah.
I used to hate, for example, going by feedlots. I spent a lot of time in feedlots growing up because that's what my daddy did. He was a beef cattleman, right? But now I like going by feedlots. You know why? The smell of cow manure reminds me of my dad. And so it is a ritual for me, right? And you'd have asked the 10-year-old if that would ever happen, he would have said no, right? But that's the ritual that has become for me. My wife knows it too. She said, hey, there he is again.
I don't know if this is exactly a ritual, but the way I've gotten through so much of my life is reading.
Mm.
It's the thing that transports me to other worlds. When my health is bad, I can go places and study things, and learning gives me great pleasure, and then sharing books with people.
Yeah.
Even, it's just like reading this book and sharing information with each other is really,
yes.
that feeds my soul.
Yeah. And what I would say, Judy, is that's a ritual, but it's also going towards her last point. Her last point was about ancestor spirits, right? And when she talked about ancestor spirits, she was not just talking about those who gave us birth. She was seen in a much larger space. And so she said it's blood family and it's extended family and friends, but it's also, and I think that this is where you're talking, inspirational historical figures and I added inspirational, non-historical figures. All of those voices who somehow speak a larger picture into us. And it's a ritual, but it's also an honoring of very real life alive in us. My dad, in that smelling of cow manure, becomes alive for me again. And so is one of my ancestor spirits that continues to speak. And those rituals allow that speaking to happen, right? Who is alive for you in some space, maybe unexpectedly sometimes. For Judy, I heard in books, she has alive spaces there. Siri.
There's a mentor I had. She's the first one who did a power animal retrieval for me and taught me how to do shamanic journey work. And I just feel and kind of hear and sense her presence from time to time.
Mm.
And I can even, kind of like ask, like talk to her, not literally out loud, but just kind of, try to connect with her or try to communicate something and have that sense that she's there.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing thing. I as I do memorial services, one of the things that I say almost every single time is, I know right now you're dealing with the loss, but my job is to help you get to where you know that there's maybe a possibility of that person still being alive, right? Because in the midst of death, we lose the one we had, at least in the way that they were there. But as we go forward, we realize that they're not completely gone, right? They still speak. We still listen. We still can speak to them, just not quite in the same way. And that's what the ritual helps with, is it helps us take those spirit voices and place them into the new relationship they're going to be in. So how do you hear the spirit voices? What are some of the ways you purposely try to tap into that larger?
This conversation helped me, or made me realize I'm missing a big aspect of my life.
Yeah.
I am a Reiki practitioner. I was very sick all of last year, but I wasn't touching I wasn't working on anybody.
Yeah.
And that's a real big, important part of me connecting with people, but more so connecting to the larger connection.
That's right. Thank you.
My Swedish grandmother was a baker, so the smell of yeast dough baking is like euphoric.
Yeah, brings her right back into your heart, doesn't it?
Yeah, every time.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot.
Or I even found last week, I was using a rolling pin and rolling something out, and it was going really easily. And I was thinking, boy, my mom, I wish she could see this, because I could never do it when she was trying to train me, and then, but then that started all the thoughts about her, which that connection was, it was just so nice to feel that.
Yeah, nice. The good news is next week, we'll go back and say, how do we work very purposely about developing all of this, right? What are those empowerment tools that allow the teacher to come out better? But just know that any of this kind of work that allows you to hear those voices, those wisdom voices from the past, also help you to be a better wise one in your today. I mean, I think the reason why very often times older people are seen as the source of wisdom is because they have more wisdom to draw from. They're not so busy doing jobs. They're not so busy being the active person. They're busy listening to the voices and thus being able to speak those voices out into the world. And that's kind of what we want to try to do, is hear ways to listen better. It's a good ongoing work. The way of the teacher is one that instructs, first of all, the teacher before the students can ever learn, right? And so the good teacher always has to be moved by. And so as we go into our last week and we learn the last little bits of this teacher, think about how this whole class has kind of taught you, and then what it's going to allow your voice, how it's going to allow your voice to speak differently as we move forward in the future. Okay? Any last questions?
Just to clarify, so we have our last session at 3, and then the white fragility starts at 4?
No, the next week after. And
The next week after,
yeah,
okay.
and I actually said that wrong. It's going to start at the same hour, 3 o'clock.
Oh, at 3, okay.
It's going to start at 3 o'clock. And so I said that wrong on Sunday, so I'll correct it this week coming up. But yeah, I can't start another class until I get this one over with.
Yeah, I couldn't imagine.
For hard
how
enough.
you were gonna do it. Too much.
Yeah, but I hope you're able to come to the white fragility class too, because I think that those kinds of questions that book will ask us are just essential in this moment. It's a good learning moment, isn't it? But
Yeah.
we have to learn beyond what's easiest for us. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Take
Jen.
care.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.
Take care.